Hello, beautifuls. My name is Quavia, and welcome to JuJu Thyme. For today's Afro Folktale, I have a hoodoo spooky story for you. Now, we can give all thanks to Miss Zora Neale Hurston for the preservation of this Afro Folktale. Now, regarding this story, if you've been following me in my Sacred Serpent series for quite some time now, then you probably know about High John. And if you haven't seen my video on High John, then I highly recommend that after this video, you go and give this one a listen to. But this tale is about High Walker. Have you ever heard of him? Well, after today, you will say that you know of High Walker and a very important lesson that he teaches us. But before I even get into that, I want you to get comfortable, get relaxed, and yeah, I hope you enjoy this spooky story. This was a man. His name was High Walker. He walked into a boneyard with skull heads and other bones, so he would call them, "Rise up, bloody bones, and shake yourself." And the bones would rise up and come together and shake themselves in part and lay back down. Then he would say to himself, "High Walker," and the bones would say, "Be walking." When he'd get off a little way, he'd look back over his shoulder and shake himself and say, "High Walker and bloody bones," and the bones would shake themselves. Therefore, he knowed he had power. So a man sold himself to the high chief devil. He gave him his whole soul and body to do as he pleased with it. He went out in the drifter woods and laid down flat on his back beyond all these skull heads and bloody bones and said, "Go away, Lord, and come here, devil, and do as you please with me, 'cause I want to do everything in the world that's wrong and never do nothing right." And he dried up and died away on doing wrong. His meat all left his bones, and the bones all was separated. And at the time, High Walker walked upon his skull head and kicked it on ahead of him a many a times and said to it, "Rise up and shake yourself. High Walker is here." Old Skullhead wouldn't say nothing. He looked back over his shoulder 'cause he heard some noises behind him and said, "Bloody bones, won't you say nothing yet? Rise to the power in the flesh." Then the Skullhead said, "My mouth brought me here, and if you don't mind, yours will bring you here." High Walker went on back to his white folks and told the white man that a dry skullhead was talking in the drift today. White man said he didn't believe it. "Well, if you don't believe it, come go with me, and I'll prove it. And if it don't speak, you can chop my head off right where it at." So, the white man and High Walker went back in the drift to find this old skullhead. So when he walked up to it, he began to kick the old skull head, but it wouldn't say nothing. High Walker looked at the white man and seen him whetting his knife, whetting it hard, and the sound of it said, "Rick to Rick, Rick to Rick, Rick to Rick." So High Walker kicked that old skull head and called it many a times, but it never said nothing. So the white man cut off High Walker's head. And the old dry skull head said, "See that now? I told you that mouth brought me here, and if you don't mind out, it'll bring you here." So the bloody bones rise up and shook theyselves 7 times, and the white man got scared and said, "What do you mean by this?" The bloody bones say, "We got High Walker, and we all bloody bones now in the drift together." Man, if this story is not fuck around and find out, then I don't know what is, okay? Oh my goodness. Alrighty, so there are two important characters in this tale, okay? There's Highwalker and Old Skullhead, and they teach us a very important message. But first, there are so many juicy bits in this tale that I just want to cuddle up in my blanket and talk to you about. So, get comfortable. So, in this tale, Highwalker obviously has a lot of power, okay? He brings these skull heads and other bones with him to the boneyard. A boneyard is a very, very informal way to say a cemetery, right? So he brings these skull heads and other bones with him to the boneyard just so that he can call on the bones and make them shake and rise up. You know, I love the part where the tale says, he knowed he had power. Ugh, I don't know what it is about that. I love that like phrase, you know, because at some point in our journey, we are fully aware of this feeling when we recognize this kind of thing inside of us, this power, and it's undeniable. Depending on when this power displayed itself in your life, it can be very intoxicating. But in that moment, like, we know we have power. And it's not a belief or a thought of maybe, it's a knowing. So I think we can all resonate more or less with the feeling of knowing we have power. Whether you are at the beginning of your spiritual or witchcraft journey, or you're well seasoned, you begin to recognize where your strengths lie, and all you want to do sometimes is exercise that power. But we come to find out later that this would be Highwalker's downfall. But I'm getting ahead of myself. So, because of this tale, we also know that Highwalker is, you can say, a two-headed doctor in the hoodoo practice. To put it very simply, for the sake of not going off on a tangent right now, a two-headed doctor is a very powerful conjurer. And this is what Highwalker is. And again, we see that in his power, in his ability to move the bones, right? So we also see that Highwalker is so full of himself. Even from the very beginning, we see him do a call and response kind of action when he says, Highwalker, and the bones would say, be walking. You know, it's giving very much conceited type of energy. So unfortunately, Highwalker is filled with overconfidence and lacks in wisdom. You know, he goes on calling out for the bones to awaken. He invokes his power and displays it over them just to show it off, you know, and we have to admit he's good at it. But we also see that he lacks in respect. We see in the tale that Highwalker is in a cemetery and he finds this skull head just laying about, which is strange in itself to find an unburied skull. But we learn that this skull is Old Skullhead, and Highwalker comes upon this skull in the boneyard, and he has no reverence towards it at all. He just begins to kick it around, and then Highwalker tries to command Old Skullhead to rise up and shake for him. Now, we learn a little bit of the history of Old Skullhead. His name is no matter. What we know is that he sold his soul to the devil and wanted to live his life doing wrong. And this is how he lived and died. Now, maybe you are wondering, is there a devil in hoodoo? Or perhaps you're remembering a time I have said that in Afro spiritual practices and religions, there is no devil. And this is true. There is no devil in hoodoo, at least not within the Abrahamic biblical context. the devil, at least in the hoodoo perspective, is more complex and nuanced. How can I say? Like, they're seen as more of a trickster-like figure, which, if you have listened to my other tales that have tricksters in them, they are always the ones with the wisdom, or they're always like the master teacher, or they are cunning and are able to get out of tricky situations. You see trickster-like individuals helping the enslaved Africans in many, many tales. I have even read a tale where the quote-unquote devil helps a woman out in an unjust situation, which allows her to gain power over the situation. So yes, it's very complex, but it's definitely not the Bible devil. And this is why Old Skullhead, when he dies, he doesn't go to some fiery hell. We see Old Skullhead end up in the cemetery. He obviously lived a life where no one cared if he was properly buried or not, and he obviously wasn't properly buried. I mean, he chose a life of violence with his life, so it's no wonder. But he doesn't go to some fiery hell. He's recycled back into the earth with the other bloody bones, and ends up being a very important teacher for Highwalker, and ultimately for us. But again, I'm getting ahead of myself. Anyway, Old Skullhead ends up in this boneyard, and his bones are just laying about scattered for who knows how long before Highwalker finds him. For me, in a way, it seems as though Old Skullhead and Highwalker are mirror images of each other in some way. You know, they both chose a life of arrogance, with no regard for anyone, spirit or otherwise. You know, Old Skullhead chose a life where he wanted to do everything in life that was wrong, and Highwalker chose a life where we see that he is doing wrong to spirits, just, you know, kicking their bones around and stuff. But back to the tales, because Highwalker begins to command Old Skullhead to move after kicking it around, by the way, and saying, "Rise up and shake yourself. Highwalker is here." Like, oh, that's so full of himself. But anyway, Old Skullhead says nothing. And we know that because Highwalker is so full of himself, he commands Old Skullhead to speak and tells him to rise to the power of the flesh. So Old Skullhead does decide to talk, and he basically prophesizes saying, "My mouth brought me here, and if you don't mind yourself, yours will bring you here too." But Highwalker does not grasp that knowledge. He doesn't hear this warning at all. You know, for him, he's above it. You know, it reminds me of that one saying. I think it came from General Iroh in Avatar: The Last Airbender. But I think he says, "Wisdom has been chasing you, but you have always been faster." Oh my goodness. This is a very polite way to say you're stupid. And this is definitely for Highwalker, for sure. All Highwalker wants to do is boast about his power and this talking skull that he, you know, has found. So he goes to his white folks. Now, I found it very interesting, actually, when I reread it, the phrase that he goes to his white folks. So we do get this, at least this feeling or a kind of knowing that Highwalker is either enslaved by these white folks or he works for them, you know, or has some loyalty to them or something like this. But we do see that they have power over him, in this claiming of his white folks. But anyway, and he tells the white man that he discovered a talking skull and that he can make the skull talk. And even promises that if he can't get the skull to talk, that the white man can chop his head off. Overall, we see Old Skullhead doesn't talk, no matter how many times Highwalker kicks him and commands him. So Highwalker gets his head chopped off, and Old Skullhead finally talks and basically said, "I told you your mouth will get you here." And at the end, all the bloody bones, they rose up and shook themselves 7 times and declared that they got Highwalker now, and they all together. Now, the number 7 in Hoodoo can be seen as the number of completion, but it's not necessarily the end of a cycle. It is considered a holy number though, but in general, we know of the number 7 being a call for us to reflect. So reflect I did. There are so many things that can be talked about regarding this tale, like for example, cemetery etiquette and things like this. You definitely do not go around, if you find something in a cemetery or graveyard or whatnot, you definitely don't go around kicking it and whatnot. Like, that's just a big no-no, right? But even this tale, you can talk about what it means to be a two-headed doctor, but the main and blatant message that I received and felt called to talk about was clearly what not to do when working with spirits. Within the spiritual and witchcraft community, there can be a lot of fear around working with spirits. There's also internalized fear depending on which religion you come from or the culture that you come from, and so on. And this whole conversation is not to make you afraid of what spirit can do. Actually, this tale is teaching us what not to do, and Highwalker paid the price for us to learn this. Right? So in the tale, there is a clear difference between, at least from what I saw, there's a clear difference between the bones and the spirit that Highwalker brought with him, which we can assume he has some kind of relationship with or has been working with them for however long, versus the unfamiliar bones and spirit that Highwalker stumbles upon. His ability to conjure and command spirits, because he is a two-headed doctor, leads him to arrogantly believe that when he says jump, all spirits are meant to jump. And don't get me wrong, he clearly has this power, but it just, at least the way he was walking, it just screams privilege, and this abuse of power. So how do we know if a spirit wants to work with us? Mainly, people rely on divination methods. Others rely on their psychic senses, basically feeling for an invite or not. But most time, people combine both of these methods. This requires you to develop your intuition, your psychic abilities, and trust in yourself. And this alone takes time to differentiate what is you and what is spirit. So definitely take that time. And there's so many sources out there on how to do that. But we clearly see that Old Skullhead, in terms of, trying to figure out if the spirit wants to work with you or not, we clearly see that Old Skullhead did not want to speak or have anything to do with Highwalker. Even when Highwalker commanded him to. With spirits that we haven't developed some kind of rapport with, there could be silence or inactivity in whatever we are trying to invoke. And it doesn't necessarily mean that they don't want to work with you. But it could be a call that either one, the spirit is not for you, or two, it can be a call for you to build a better relationship. But overall, it's okay if a spirit does not want to work with you, or you don't have access to that spirit for whatever reason. It's okay. If anything, it could be a part of your protection. Now, what you do or don't do in your practice is completely up to you. It's no one's business. But if you keep insisting and pushing like Highwalker did, it does, through his story, it does show that it had a dangerous consequence, Now, regarding building a relationship with the spirit, you'll want to define what kind of relationship you want to have with the spirits and what kind of relationship they want to have with you. Don't get me wrong. There are some situations where there is a dominant and commanding kind of relationship, and to each their own, for sure. We see for Highwalker, because of his ability to be a two-headed doctor, this works 100% for him, at least until he meets Old Skullhead. But overall, you can argue that in Highwalker's case, this, dominate and command kind of relationship, it does work. The bones did shake and they did move when he commanded. But once you can determine the kind of relationship you want and what they want, then you can start moving in the appropriate way to establish that. In Highwalker's case, though, he displays a lack of respect, which teaches us that when we are working with spirits, known and unknown, that we should carry some decorum, respect, and boundaries. Highwalker does not display this towards his spirits, because as soon as he dies, at the end, all the bloody bones, they rise up together and they declare that we have Highwalker now, and we are all bloody bones now in the drift together. They took him. They completely took him, and they claimed him as their own. Once again, this is not to spread fear. This is not to spread fear. This is meant to be a spooky tale, though, so. But in terms of our own workings, this is not to spread fear. Overall, we learn to operate in a sense that spirits are unseen consciousnesses that have their own will and wants. And we should want to respect those boundaries and respect them. This is why I feel reverence is very important in hoodoo. Reverence is not worshiping. It's showing and treating someone or something with deep, deep respect. And it's a fine line. I'm not going to lie. Like, when I really think about it, I feel personally that as a part of the seen consciousness, we have to walk in a way of knowing, claiming, and commanding our power. We want to walk in a way of not being belittled towards ourselves, and not to let anyone or anything belittle us. But at the same time, it's understanding that we are in relationship with everything and everyone around us. And there is no need to impose our will on anything or anyone, especially when it's not wanted. Hoodoo is a culture of respect, because there is an understanding that there is not only an interdependent relationship between everything in our seen world, but there is also an interdependent relationship between the seen and unseen world. Yes, we need spirit just as much as spirit needs us, but at the same time, at least in my opinion, Spirits are independent consciousnesses, all at a various level, of course. That's a whole other topic. But they are independent consciousnesses, and they have a reach that partly we cannot comprehend in our human bodies and human minds. So to say that they need us, I don't know, it also feels very wrong at the same time, But no matter what, respect should be given all around. Basically, honor your own boundaries when working with spirits, but also honor their boundaries as well. What kind of relationship do they want? What do they require or like? Can you fulfill that requirement or not? Do they want to work with you? I mean, there's so many questions that we can ask. Not every spirit wants to work with you, as we saw from the story, Everything has this interdependent, symbiotic relationship. As I'm coming to an end, I also want to mention how in Afro spirituality, your head and the back of your neck are very spiritual and sensitive places. And these are the places you want to protect the most. So it's very interesting in the story that High Walker arrogantly offers up his neck to his executioner of the story, And not only that, I was also thinking, he goes to, he could have gone to anybody to display this power of his, but he went to his white folks, which is why there's like this sense of ownership, at least, that he went to them and offers up his neck to his executioners, and the fact that he lost his head is a clear sign that he lost his destiny and power, which we clearly see. Overall, High Walker, due to his lack of understanding the interdependence of everything that was around him, and due to his arrogance with his abilities, he ended up fucking around and finding out. And he ended up with a fate or destiny where he enters a state of completion, meaning he dies, but at the end of his cycle, he is joined with the other bloody bones. And as I said, they claim him and he is forever joined with them. Like Old Skullhead, High Walker experiences the consequences of his actions, which ultimately will make him the ultimate teacher for the next passerby, who I hope doesn't go around kicking his head around. Oh my goodness. I love a spooky tale, but once again, this tale is not about spreading senseless fear. It's about giving practitioners a cautionary tale for when boundaries and respect are overlooked, and what happens when the interdependent nature of everything is ignored. Hoodoo teaches African descendant people how to live in this world and how to be in harmony with it in everything. In Hoodoo, along with other Afro spiritualities and religions, you can consider this to be one of its fundamental cornerstones. But anyway, beautifuls, just like you, I am but standing in front of the ocean in the cosmos in complete admiration of how much I don't know. I am grateful that I get to be a student of myself in the world so I can continue to grow, learn, and see what else unfolds. May we never let our mouths and our ego be out of check to the point where it brings us to places that we ultimately do not want to be. That is my prayer for us in this tale. But until the next one, beautifuls, truth and love.